The glass of champagne slipped from my hand the second his palm struck my face. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a rifle shot. Sharp, humiliating, final. I didn't even feel the sting right away. I felt the silence. 200 guests frozen mid-toast, staring. Somewhere behind me, a phone camera clicked open. By the time I turned, a dozen more were already recording. "You're no son of mine," my father thundered, voice amplified by fury and marble walls. "You've embarrassed this family for the last time, Noah." Noah Whitaker. That's who I was, at least according to every birth certificate, driver's license, and Christmas card I'd ever known. But that night, as my father, Richard Whitaker, real estate magnate and self-proclaimed king of Denver, announced to the world that I was cut from his will, I had no idea that the name itself was the biggest lie of all. The slap, the disinheritance, the flashing phones, those were just the beginning tremors. The earthquake came later. I remember my mother standing beside him, perfect as ever in her midnight blue gown, her smile frozen, her eyes darting between us like a referee who'd lost control of the game. "Richard, please," she whispered, but her voice had no conviction. She was the queen of image management, and right then, her kingdom was collapsing live on social media. By morning, my humiliation had been viewed over 6 million times. Air disowned at billionaire's birthday gala. The headline screamed. The comments section was a mix of outrage, memes, and amateur psychologists diagnosing my every facial twitch. My workshop phone rang nonstop with reporters. I unplugged it, shut the blinds, and tried to sand away the shame. That's when the knock came. 3 sharp raps that didn't belong in my quiet, sawdust-filled world. When I opened the door, 3 people stood there, 2 men and a woman, dressed in dark suits that didn't quite fit the neighborhood. "Mr. Whitaker," the woman asked softly, "I'm afraid that's not your real name." Her name was Evelyn Grant, and she slid a folder across my workbench like she was handing over evidence from a murder scene. "You were born Jacob Hale," she said. "Your biological father, Samuel Hale, has been searching for you since you were taken from a park in Portland 35 years ago." I laughed, actually laughed, because it was absurd. I'd just been disowned, and now they were telling me I'd been kidnapped too? But then she opened the file. There was a photo of a baby with my eyes, my chin. A man and woman holding him, both smiling with the kind of warmth I'd never seen at a Whitaker family function. And on the baby's wrist, a tiny silver bracelet with a train engine charm. The same one I still wore, the same one my mother had claimed was a family heirloom. The room spun. My knees gave out. The only thing keeping me upright was the old oak table I'd been refinishing. I stared at the grain, the whorls and knots that time had carved into it, and realized it had more honest history than I did. Growing up, I'd always known I was the disappointment. My brother, Lucas, was the golden boy on Wall Street, the kind who made $1 million before breakfast. My sister, Claire, ran a law firm that politicians tripped over themselves to hire. And me? I restored furniture in a converted tire shop, covered in sawdust, happy to resurrect things everyone else thought were broken beyond repair. My father hated that about me. He called my work a hobby for people with no ambition. He offered me a 7-figure position in his company once, complete with a driver and an office overlooking the city. I turned it down because I couldn't imagine living in a world that measured worth only in profit margins. "You're choosing failure," he'd said. "I'm choosing peace," I'd replied. Apparently, I hadn't chosen my own life at all. After Evelyn and her colleagues left, I sat there for hours, staring at the photos. At my real parents. At the proof that every family dinner, every birthday, every argument with Richard Whitaker had been part of a lie so big it could crush the air out of my lungs. The next morning, I drove to see Mrs. Ashworth, one of my oldest clients. She was in her 70s, all pearls and wisdom, and she'd always looked at me with a strange kind of curiosity. When I told her what I'd learned, she didn't look shocked. "I always knew something about you didn't fit in that family," she said, pouring tea into porcelain cups that had seen more truth than I ever had. "Gentle hands like yours don't come from men like Richard Whitaker." I asked her what she meant, but she only smiled. "Some things are written in the soul, Jacob, no matter what name the world gives you." That night, I sat alone in my workshop, surrounded by the only honest things I owned, the furniture I'd saved. I realized that maybe my whole life had been a rehearsal for this moment, taking what was broken and giving it back its story. Only this time, The thing that needed restoring was me. They'd watched our families unraveling long enough to know when to vanish behind polite smiles and full glasses. By the time the Whitakers gathered in Aspen for my father's 60th, even the waitstaff moved quietly, the way people do when they've learned survival depends on not being noticed. I'd spent the afternoon in the study, adjusting the desk I'd spent 3 months restoring until the leather inlay caught the mountain light just right. Mahogany, brass hardware sourced from an antique dealer in Vermont, the stain blended from 7 different formulas to match the original grain. It was my finest work, elegant, alive, and utterly wasted on the man it was meant for. By 7, Richard Whitaker was holding court in the grand hall like the monarch he'd always imagined himself to be. A tumbler of 30-year-old scotch in one hand, he commanded the room with laughter that belonged to a man who'd never heard the word no. Investors, senators, and socialites circled him like satellites orbiting a dying star. My brother Lucas worked the East Wing, pitching his latest crypto venture with the intensity of a televangelist. Claire, ever the golden child, stood near the fireplace, dazzling a state senator who'd long forgotten his wedding ring. I stayed close to the edge of the chaos, nursing a beer with my Uncle Henry, one of the few people left who still spoke to me like I was more than a family embarrassment. "You clean up good, Noah," he said, raising his bottle. We were the only two with beer instead of champagne that cost more per ounce than a mechanic's wage. "The shop's doing all right," I said, the pride in my voice unguarded for once. "Just landed a contract with the Denver History Museum. They want me to restore their gold rush-era collection." Henry's grin creased his weathered face. "That's real work. Work that matters. You should be proud." For about 30 seconds, I was. "Noah." My father's voice sliced through the noise, sharp enough to still every conversation. "Come here, son. Tell everyone about your little hobby shop." The word hobby hit harder than I'd like to admit. Heads turned. Cameras rose. I spotted Lucas smirking into his drink, Claire pretending not to watch, and a dozen faces half hidden behind their phones. My cousin Nate already had his recording app open, ready for the latest episode of Whitaker Family Theater. I walked through the parted crowd, each step heavier than the last. Richard stood in the middle of his admirers, his eyes gleaming with that familiar look, the one he wore right before crushing a rival deal. "Actually, Dad," I said, forcing calm into my voice, "I have something for you. In your study. I think you'll appreciate it. A gift." He barked a laugh, short and cruel. "What could you possibly give me, Noah? A stool? A table? Maybe one of your quaint, hand-sanded curiosities?" Uneasy chuckles rippled around him. Some guests looked away. Most didn't. "You know what your real gift could be," Richard continued, his voice rising, relishing the audience. "Stop pretending that carpentry is a career. You're 35, no wife, no kids, living above a workshop that smells like turpentine and failure. You make less in a year than Lucas makes in a month, less than Claire bills in a week. And you call that success?" "Richard," my mother, Margaret, whispered, reaching for his arm. "Please." He jerked away. "No, Margaret. I'm done pretending he's just finding himself. The truth is, he's a disappointment." The room went utterly still. Then came the sound, sharp, clean, final. His hand against my face. I left before anyone could speak. The drive from Aspen to Denver took 3 hours, but it felt like crossing continents. Behind me, the mahogany desk lay wrapped in moving blankets, a coffin for the last piece of hope I'd ever had that Richard Whitaker could be proud of me. My phone buzzed nonstop, notifications lighting up the cab like a storm. Headlines, clips, and one from Nate. "Billionaire father slaps son at birthday gala." By the time I reached my workshop, the clip had millions of views. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, every step heavier than the last. The smell of linseed oil and sawdust greeted me like an old friend. For the first time all night, I let myself breathe. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the phones, the pitying faces, my father's fury. At 2 a.m., I gave up and went downstairs. The unfinished rocking chair on my workbench waited, the cherrywood's flame pattern glowing faintly under the shop light. I traced its curve with my thumb. Then came the anger, not fiery, but cold, deliberate. The kind that makes you build something instead of break it. I grabbed a yellow notepad and started writing. If Richard wanted to cut me out of his will, fine. I'd build my own legacy. I drafted a plan. expand to Santa Fe and Portland, partner with museums, start an apprenticeship program for young craftspeople who needed a chance. For the first time in my life, I was building something for me, not to prove I belonged to the Whitakers. At 6, the phone rang. Mrs. Ashworth's name lit the screen. I almost ignored it, but something in her persistence made me answer. "Noah, dear," she said, her voice gentle but trembling. "I saw what happened. That horrible man. Are you all right?" "I will be," I told her, and for the first time, I meant it. "Before you make any big decisions," she continued, her tone shifting, "there's something you should know. I've known your family for 50 years. I knew Richard before the towers and the scandals. I knew Margaret before she became Mrs. Whitaker, and I knew you before they did." My grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" "There were always things that didn't add up, Noah. The timing. The records. You appeared in their lives when you were supposedly 2 years old, but there are no photos before that. No birth announcement. No hospital record from St. Luke's, where Margaret said she gave birth. Maybe they lost the pictures," I said weakly. "Maybe," she replied softly. "Or maybe the reason you could never be the son Richard wanted is because you were never meant to be his son at all. Be home around 9. Please, Noah. I've waited 35 years to right a terrible wrong." At exactly 9, a knock echoed through my apartment. 3 firm raps that made my heart stumble. When I opened the door, 3 strangers stood there. The woman in front wore a charcoal gray suit and confidence like armor. "Noah Whitaker?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes. My name is Evelyn Grant. I'm a senior partner at Grant, Cole, and Reed. These are my colleagues, Daniel Cole and Mason Reed. We represent your biological father. May we come in?" I stared at her. "My what?" "Your biological father," she repeated gently. "Samuel Hale. He's been searching for his kidnapped son for 35 years. I laughed, but it came out hollow. "That's impossible. I have a birth certificate. Records. Everything says I'm Richard and Margaret's son." Evelyn opened a folder and slid a photo across the table once we'd sat down. A man and woman in their 30s, smiling in a park, holding a baby with my eyes. Around the baby's wrist gleamed a tiny silver bracelet shaped like a train engine, the same one I'd worn my whole life. "This was taken 6 weeks before you were taken from Laurelhurst Park in Portland," Evelyn said. "Your name was Jacob Hale." My stomach dropped. Daniel unfolded a yellowed police report. June 12, 1990. 6-month-old Jacob Hale abducted from his stroller. The nanny was distracted by a woman asking for directions to a hospital that didn't exist. The nanny later described the woman as having Margaret Whitaker's build and eyes. Mason spoke next, his voice steady. "The woman who took you wasn't your mother, Noah. She was desperate after multiple miscarriages. She paid the nanny $50,000 to look away." Evelyn slid another document across the table. 3 months ago, a DNA match from a genealogy database confirmed it. "You're Jacob Hale, Samuel Hale's only child." The world tilted. Evelyn's tone softened. "Your biological father asked us to handle this carefully, especially after the public humiliation last night. He's been following your life since the DNA match, quietly, waiting for the right time." 2 weeks later, Richard and Margaret Whitaker were arrested at their country club. The FBI had been building the case ever since Samuel provided them the evidence. Fraudulent adoption papers, bribes, forged medical records, the entire empire of deceit collapsing under its own weight. Richard shouted about lawyers and conspiracies as they led him away in cuffs. The cameras caught it all. The same crowd that watched him slap me now watched his empire burn. Margaret confessed first. She'd found the adoption ring online, convinced Richard it was legitimate. She'd lived in fear for decades, praying the truth would never surface. Lucas called me once, drunk and remorseful. Claire sent a letter, brief, polite, full of legal phrasing and emotional distance. But the real reckoning came when I met Samuel Hale. He didn't rush to embrace me. He just stood there outside my shop, a tall man with silver hair and the same green eyes I saw in the mirror. "You still wear it," he said quietly, glancing at my bracelet. "I've worn the matching one every day since you disappeared." We went for coffee. He told me about my mother, Eleanor, who died of cancer 5 years ago, never giving up hope I was alive. She'd kept my nursery exactly as it was for 30 years. "You build things," Samuel said, his voice thick with pride. "You mend what's broken. That's how I built Hale Technologies. Maybe some things are just written into us." Mrs. Ashworth came to visit soon after. Turns out she was my godmother, Eleanor's closest friend from college. She'd recognized me at an estate auction 20 years earlier and had been searching for proof ever since. I moved my workshop to Portland, close to Samuel's headquarters. He offered to buy me a building, but I refused. "This is mine," I told him, "built with my own hands." The rocking chair I made that night sits in his living room now. He rocks in it every evening, telling stories about my mother, about the 6 months they had before I was stolen. Beside it sits the mahogany desk, the one I made for Richard Whittaker. Samuel bought it at the Whittaker estate auction for 10 times its worth. "To keep it in the family," he said, "the right one this time." Sometimes the truth breaks you before it sets you free. But as I walk through my workshop now, the scent of cedar and varnish in the air, I know this much. Blood might write our beginnings, but what we build with our own hands, that's who we really are.